Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 3 of Conversations About America, where we talk about important and relevant topics. My distinguished panel is Jeffrey Deskovic, who is an attorney that was once falsely convicted and imprisoned. Robert Gonzalez, author of a book called Eagle's Claws for Freedom's Cause. Quentin Ford, host of a great talk show called Let's Talk. And if he makes it in, Michael Landingham, who ran for president in 2020, running again in 2024. So he might come in here in a minute. So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you all for coming on.
Thank you, Steve.
Good evening. Thanks for having us.
As you know, we're talking about the Civil War. And before we get into the actual war itself, let's talk a little bit about what life was like between the American Revolution and the Civil War. And what it was like depended on who you were and how much money you had and what color you were. For example, if you were a white slave holder, you had a big plantation probably with maybe hundreds or thousands of slaves to work on your cotton field or tobacco field or whatever. And if you was unfortunate and you were one of the black slaves, then you probably had a miserable existence. You lived in an old shack with a dirt floor and probably holes in the roof and holes in the ceiling, and you were treated horribly. So it was totally different for different people. So does anybody like to say anything about that? Feel free. Okay. Let's look at the election of Abraham Lincoln. And that was a big deal. Did you know that some of the Southerners considered him being elected as an act of war?
Yeah.
I didn't know that before, but I did read some history. You had shared a link with us, and it did state that, and being as though he was opposed to slavery and that the South's economy, the way they had built it, really was built upon slavery. I mean, it's logical that they would have felt that way. I mean, it's been horrible morally and ethically, but I could see how they would think that's an act of war.
Yeah.
And actually, it was, because it turned out to be, war. In order to abolish slavery. So they were right about that. That there was going to be an end to that terrible institution of slavery.
Yeah. You want to weigh in on that, Quentin?
I'm here. Nothing more to add to that. I mean, the history is like we always know is the history. I always find it amazing that when you look back at it, even though as we were kids and we were taught American history, and then when you go back and look at it from a different lens as an adult, you always find different things. And it's amazing how even to this day you see how the economy to the northern states are quote unquote doing well compared to those southern states during that time, and even up until this day. It basically with what you said with Abraham Lincoln being named president in an act of war, and then the Civil War ensued after, it actually destroyed the economy for the southern states. Even to this day, they're still suffering from it because this is what their economy basically strived off for.
Yeah, it did. In the north, the economy was basically on factory work, if I remember correctly, a lot of industries. Bob, you got anything to say about that?
Well, from what I've heard, I think the beginnings of the war were more about them wanting to secede from the Union more than it was necessarily about slavery. There were a lot of Southerners that were even opposed to slavery. Robert E. Lee was opposed to slavery, but he felt his duty. In fact, Lincoln even offered him the command of the Union forces, but he felt his duty was to, what at that time was called his country, which was his state, Virginia. So he chose to fight on the Virginia side, even though he was opposed to slavery.
Yeah.
I think that, unfortunately, that was a immoral practice, but it was commonplace, and not just in America, but all over the world. I think that America was probably the leader in freeing slaves more so than other countries, and I don't think that gets talked about enough.
You know, there were some Southern politicians that were spreading the rumors around the South that if Lincoln was elected, that he was going to set all the slaves free and he was going to confiscate the lands of the slave owners. But actually what Lincoln ran on, he said he was not going to try to abolish slavery in the states that already had slavery. He just wanted to make sure the states that were added later on were not slave states. So, you know, that didn't turn out the way that some people thought it was going to, did it? Now, the size of the opposing armies was very, very different. There was roughly between 750,000 and 1 million soldiers for the Confederacy is what I dug up. And the Union soldiers, they were over 2 million of them.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at it from that perspective, the Union certainly had the advantage on the troops, didn't they?
Yeah, the South had the will to fight. The Union had the numbers.
Yeah. And also, since Lincoln was the president, he had access to a lot more money to put into it. He also had command of the railroads. He was able to move his soldiers on the railroads. And he also had a telegraph station right across the street from the White House. So he could send telegraphs to his generals.
Are you other guys still there?
Do what? So that was definitely a big advantage, wasn't it?
Yeah, clearly.
Are you okay? David, you're there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, we missed out after the railroads. You cut out on me.
Oh, did I? Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. I said Lincoln had the advantage of being able to transport soldiers, you know, around the railroads. And he also had a telegraph machine right across from the White House. So he could telegraph messages to the generals all over the country. So that was obviously a big advantage, wasn't it?
Yeah, they had huge advantages in numbers and money and industry and everything.
Yeah.
But they didn't, what the South had was they had better generals on the ground and the will to fight. They were fighting for their livelihoods. The North, there was a lot of apathy in the North.
Yeah.
They were kind of, yeah. You know, but that's how it goes, I guess.
That's an interesting perspective there, Bob. The South, they were fighting for their livelihood.
Mhm.
And I guess you could say the Northerners were fighting on principle. You know, they were fighting because they knew slavery was wrong.
Yeah.
So do you think, but still yet, the Northerners had enough, whatever they won? And I'm glad they did. But it sure did make a lot of Southerners angry, didn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
I don't think the North, Steve, I don't think the North had a plan though. I mean, I think their plan was to win the war, but I think if you look at it, after they won the war, so to say,
Yeah.
they just left the South unoccupied. And it was basically, it has basically up until this time, basically been, they won the war and the South just got left abandoned. I think this is probably, if you look back at it now, a war where it was won and it wasn't won for like occupation of a land, so to say. It was basically won because, like you guys stated, because they felt as though they wanted the Southern states to become more part of the Union, and one of the biggest issues were slavery, but it kind of left the South hopeless, for lack of better words. I mean, I mean, I always think about their economy and how it's affected. And you know, one of the things that I just did last weekend was I actually drove through the region. I just drove through Gettysburg last Monday.
Did you?
And when you sit back and you play the tape in your head, what you've read, and you go through these areas, you look at the proximity of some of even the quote unquote North and the South. I mean, look at West Virginia and Virginia. We were taught West Virginia and Virginia was broken up basically because of slavery. But when you look at it, in all actuality, it wasn't. It was just basically, this is where this, excuse the fireworks, I'm very
That's
close.
okay.
To
We've all got them. I hear them outside my window.
when you look at the proximity of some of these places, even in the state of Virginia, you know, and you play the tape in your head, you realize how it really wasn't a North and a South fight like some of us may think it was. It was more of, like you and Bob and Jeff explained, it was more of the Union and the Confederacy.
But you know, the Confederacy, it was about state rights for them, but also they wanted the right to have slaves. So
Yeah,
you can't really say it was one or the other, and it was both. And you know, also the Northerners didn't want slavery to extend to the West as more states were added, and that was a big thing for Lincoln. Welcome
and
back.
probably if the war wouldn't have been fought, it would have. They were basically, as we would say, they fought the war for basically the fabric of the country, because like you said, the country was expanding more west. And if let's just say, for me, I would just say the Southern thought would have got to the Western states, the Northern or the Union would have been in serious trouble.
Yeah. And it was interesting that the war did not end on the same day for everybody.
Yeah, actually, the last two battles were Confederate victories.
Yeah. So on April the 9th of 1865 is when General Robert E. Lee surrendered his troops to Ulysses Grant at Appomattox. I'm not sure how to say that.
Appomattox.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Appomattox. But it was 16 months later before Andrew Johnson would declare a formal end to the conflict. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, you know, one thing I wanted to add before we get off to another subject was, I think if Lincoln was able to live and finish out his life's work, he would have been more conciliatory to the South. I think that Andrew Johnson came in and had harsh policies, and he didn't have really a good personality to lead the country through Reconstruction. He was ill-tempered. He was like a mean-spirited kind of guy, and he was even impeached. I don't think any of those things would have happened if Lincoln had lived. Lincoln always wanted to be friends. He said we must not be enemies. And even before the war, he said to listen to the better angels of our nature. So that's a shame that he wasn't able to finish his work. I think things in this country would have been a lot better had he been able to do that.
So overall, do you think his presidency made a good difference then?
Lincoln's presidency overall, yeah, sure. You know, he kept the Union intact. Slavery was abolished. You know, those were probably the two most important things. And yeah, it was still a successful presidency for sure.
Jeffrey, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I definitely think that we're better off for him having been president for the same reasons that Bob just mentioned.
Yeah. Quentin, you want to add anything to that?
Of course. I mean, you know, everybody. I think what's funny is that I think Lincoln's presidency doesn't get his just due in American history. He's probably, if you look at what happened during his presidency, he's probably the most influential presidency ever. It's almost a shame, like Bob said, that his presidency got cut short, because it may have been a lot different after the war with him as the president, and even so forth. For his vice president was definitely not the nicest of guys, as Bob said.
Yeah. Yeah, that Tennessee fella didn't do all that well, did he?
Yeah.
So what about Andrew Johnson? Now, what do you think? Did he do anything good, do you think? Do you think his presidency had any good qualities?
Well, he was impeached, so I'm not really sure. The history books haven't been too kind to him.
Yeah, he has that honor of being the first president to be impeached.
Yeah.
I wonder how his ancestors, not his ancestors, but his descendants, how they feel about that. I imagine that is a big embarrassment to the Johnson family.
Sure.
And I live in Johnson City, but it wasn't named after Andrew, it was named after Henry Johnson. He was, I think, a state senator or something or another. I don't even remember. So let's move on to Reconstruction. Now that was supposed to have been after the slaves were set free, and all of a sudden everything was going to be hunky-dory and we all live happily ever after. It didn't quite happen that way, did it?
Well, I think that's where the thing with Lincoln during Reconstruction, it wasn't no plan. You had some reports say 2.5 million slaves that just basically they were set free, and the only thing most of them we were raised to do at the time was to be sharecroppers or croppers or whatever. And so now you're setting these people free and really like nowhere to go. A lot of people didn't even leave the quote unquote plantations because they had nowhere to go, even being free. You basically stayed. And this is why the holiday Juneteenth came about, because the slaves in Texas didn't even know anything about what was going on with the Civil War and being set free from the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and what happened. They didn't know. They just had no way of knowing. So
Yeah.
I think that one of the things, with that war is having as we would say, like they say in war, exit strategy. We always see in war nowadays where wars that happen and then the victor would always have like a plan on what to do with that actual territory. I think back then they didn't have a plan, even so far up when a lot of the slaves made the Great Migration up north. They were thinking they were coming up north for a better life because they always heard the stories. But in all actuality, most of them came up north and basically had nothing else to do.
Yeah.
And just, that was one of the things that I always find interesting is, my grandparents grew up in Georgia and they came up north. Now they made a better life for themselves, but, in all actuality, they probably should have stayed south. A lot of people probably should have stayed south there.
Yeah. So one of the things that went terribly wrong after the slaves were, quote, set free, unquote, they come up with all of these black codes. Are y'all familiar with those?
Yeah.
They were pretty horrible, weren't they?
Yeah, I think that is a lot of people talk about nowadays with the wealth gap, with the black codes after Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws, and so forth and so on. I think those are the effects of, here it is, you fought a war and slavery was a major component in why the war was fought, but you just left the southern states to do what they did. So yeah, the war was over from a war standpoint, but it was really still going on.
Yeah.
Not the legal explanation of slavery was still going on, but slavery was still technically going on. And being phased out of being, as we would say, living the American dream.
Yeah. I just imagine if if I would have been a slave and I had to, let's say I had a wife and 2 kids, and all of a sudden the master said, "You're free, you can go." And I might be all excited for a couple of seconds, but then would say, "Okay, where are we going? How are we going to eat? Where are we going to live?" And that had to be a big decision. You supposedly you can leave, but once you leave the plantation, you have nowhere to stay. You have no food to eat. You have no job. I mean, that had to be a terrible situation, and it wasn't the big liberation that a lot of people pretended it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any comments on that from anybody?
I wanted to bring up somebody from your neck of the woods there, Steve, Nathan Bedford Forrest. I just read it about a couple of weeks ago in the paper. They just, his remains were dug up and moved. I didn't find out where, though. Do you know anything about that?
I remember hearing something about it, but I don't remember the details. But I know there's a lot of statues of Confederate soldiers and generals all being torn down and moved. That's going on all over the place.
He enlisted in the Army as a private, and he rose to the rank of general. He rose further than anybody on either side of the war. And I think, Sherman, I think the Union general, called him the most remarkable man the war produced on either side. And then after the war, unfortunately, he became the first, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. But he unfortunately, that happened. It should never have.
Yeah. Even with the proclamation of the Declaration of Proclamation, what do they call it? Proclamation of Independence, or whatever they call that. They said the slaves were free, but there was a caveat put to that. Do you remember? Slavery was abolished except when they were
except upon being duly convicted of a felony.
Yes. Well, it didn't even have to be a felony, just any crime. So in other words, what they did, and with the Black Code and all those crazy laws, Andrew Johnson left the states with the power to make their own laws about how to deal with the freed slaves. So each of the states, in the southern states, of course, they were still wanting the slavery to go on. So they said, we'll make laws that anytime a person breaks one of these laws, we can arrest them. And that's how a lot of police got to be police. We arrest them, put them in jail, and then they can be slaves again legally. I mean, that was going on all over the place in the South.
Yeah, it makes you realize the origin of what we would consider law enforcement, and a lot of people who feel like we shouldn't have police nowadays, why they say we shouldn't have them, and because of their origin and whatever side a person stands on, they're entitled to believe what they want to believe, whether we should have them or not. But it makes you realize, like, if you know that the origin started from quote unquote post-legal slavery, maybe this leads to the mindset of certain police officers and what they feel they have to do. And even if it isn't on a racial aspect, even though the origin was on racial, but it isn't on a racial aspect, a lot of police, their mindset, sometimes it's a us versus them type of belief and how they feel, and we got to get the scum off the earth or whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever. I'm laughing, but it's kind of, you listen to certain former police officers and what they say, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But one of the things, Steve, that I wanted to say was, even now with quote unquote everybody talking about the CRT, and I know Jeff could speak to it, how the Dred Scott case was so important during the Civil War during that time, is because of the Supreme Court's ruling in the Dred Scott case. And this was kind of like the beginning, like, this is why the Union really was like enough is enough with the South stuff. And even when people that believe that CRT should be taught in our schools nowadays, it's basically talking about the legal aspect of critical race theory. Critical race theory is really basically a legal thing. It has nothing to do with quote unquote education or whatever. And I'm quite sure Jeff, going to school to be a lawyer, he kind of had to learn these things.
Yeah. Got any comments on that, Jeffrey?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's that really came out like after I gotten out of law school. But yeah, I do agree that it does have the legal foundation to it, and really it's there's been really a lot of low light type of decisions from the U.S. Supreme Court overall. I think even Plessy versus Ferguson, the separate but equal decision, which was, eventually, overruled by Brown versus Board of Education. And I think that, the correctness of that decision, and we see the implications and, after effects of that, now we're as a country, we're in a much, better place in terms of racial integration and, and that certainly wouldn't have been the case, with the had Plessy versus Ferguson continued. But you think about, how they could even decide that case in that way. There's been a lot, and really since then, it's been really a lot of low light decisions and, exalting of proceduralisms over substantive justice, where, the format or the form of legal proceedings is given much more importance as opposed to, the accuracy or correctness or justice. Even in terms of how the court even decides like what cases that they're going to hear, it's not even so much about justice for the individual litigants, but they look into, well, is it basically worth our time to even hear this case and make a decision? Is this going to, make laws clear? Is it going to harmonize decisions? Is it going to make things clear throughout the country? And that's looked at, given more weight than just, what's on the line for the, individual litigants in a case.
Yeah. So I guess that's a good point too, Jeffrey. The Supreme Court has such a big backlog of cases. They have to try to get through things quickly, don't they?
Yeah, they do. I mean, I wish that the emphasis would be more on, when someone appeals to them, then if the losing party down below, that's who appeals a case. I mean, if their claim is correct, then I feel strongly that the U.S. Supreme Court should accept those cases and, make sure that they end up in the right way. And too many times that's not the case. It's just for whatever reason, the case doesn't really hold the appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, no pun intended, hold the appeal. It doesn't really strike their fancy. They don't think that there's really a good enough benefit, to do the rest of the country beyond the individual litigants. I mean, that's something that I would really like to see changed.
Yeah. So Jeffrey, is it a totally different legal system behind the scenes for blacks as it is for whites? Are they two different sets of standards?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, race is intertwined with the justice system in many ways. I mean, one of the ways it shows itself would be in sentencing disparities. You have a black defendant, black defendants often get, much more severe sentence than somebody white on the same charge and even similar fact patterns. So it is as far as sentencing, and and then certainly we see racism intermixed with the death penalty. If the murder victim is black, then the defendant is much less likely to get the death penalty. I mean, just similarly, a black defendant is more likely to be sentenced to death than somebody who's white. So yes, then also to throw a few more stats in there, black people are 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of murder. They're 3.5 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of sexual assault. So race intersects in that way. And another aspect of it is selective enforcement. And when you look at people who are, arrested and prosecuted, just for drugs, it's most of the people that are arrested and prosecuted for drugs are minorities, but it's not because there's more prevalence of usage of drugs. There's just selective enforcement. So that's another aspect of, race intersecting with the justice system.
Yeah, good point. Any comments on that, Bob? What?
All that's true, and unfortunately, sometimes it works because of cases like that. Sometimes you have the opposite effect on these high-profile cases. Like I remember the O.J. Simpson case. Everybody felt like he was let go, and when he shouldn't have been, probably because of the stuff that Jeffrey's saying. They overcompensate the other way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think also the way that the O.J. Simpson case is perceived, has a lot to do with the race of the viewer. I mean, most white people thought that he was guilty, and a lot of minorities felt like he should have been found not guilty. So, I mean, even the way that case is, is perceived. Look at, the Central Park Five, for example. Now, there were people that were exonerated by DNA testing, and the actual perpetrator, a serial rapist, confessed to the crime, and the DNA matched him. It took a decade for them to be compensated, whereas that's a really, really long time to be compensated once you've been exonerated. And in contrast to that, many other people who've been exonerated, took maybe like 3 times less, and 3 times it was done much faster is what I'm trying to get at. And many people, myself included, believe that the way that case was perceived at the time and going forward has a lot to do with, the race of the defendants, and the race of the people who have their viewpoint on the case.
Yeah, a good point. So do you think race had anything to do with Bill Cosby going to prison or getting out?
Well, definitely not with respect to getting out. I mean, he got out on an issue of law. I mean, in short, he was told by the then prosecutor that they were not going to prosecute him. And as a result of that, he was compelled to answer questions in a civil lawsuit for the same actions. And because he was given that assurance, that was why he was not able to assert his Fifth Amendment rights. And so he made some incriminating statements in the course of the depositions of those civil lawsuits. And then, many years later, different district attorney then prosecuted him and was able to convict him based on those statements that he made in the civil deposition. So while that sucks as a decision in terms of reversing, I mean, I feel for the victims in his case, but that was absolutely the right decision legally.
Yeah. Go
I
ahead.
think Cosby's case is interesting. I think, like Jeff alluded to, I think that we do need to get back to understanding what due process is and how it protects everyone. I think that the prosecutor in the case, as a resident of Pennsylvania, you kind of could see what he did. He was trying to make a play for political office, and it backfired on him. Because this case was so high profile, Cosby should have never been charged. It's kind of crazy that he was charged. He was charged in the court of public opinion, and it's amazing that a private disposition, the contents got leaked out, which is crazy within itself. And this is why a lot of the victims of sexual abuse will never ever come out. It's really unfortunate situation when you look at what was going on during those times, and with, as we would probably say, groupies, and how one person can perceive it as having a good time, and then it could be felt like a woman or multiple women could feel violated. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm insensitive to anybody that's a victim of sexual abuse. It's just an amazing thing that when a deposition, something that was done in private got out, and now the prosecutor changed. The old prosecutor became the judge. The whole thing is like really sad that it happened that way and it affected people's lives. I really believe that the prosecutor who tried Cosby said to himself, maybe I can get him convicted and maybe he could pass away before he can get his conviction. This was an easy conviction to get overturned. I mean, Supreme Court probably seen this in Pennsylvania. Was like his Fifth Amendment was violated. I mean, this is a slam dunk overturned case. So like I said, I think that in American cases, I think sometimes we get too caught up in the sensationalization of the case and not the letter of the law. And understanding that when someone's rights are violated, right or wrong, we have to stick to the letter of the law. And that is the one thing that justices have to always do and not get caught up with. And I know a lot of time people look at decisions and be like, well, why do they make a decision this way? That's because they're interpreting the law and they're going to try to stick to the letter of the law. And it ain't about how we feel. And sometimes we're caught on the emotional ride and be like, he's a monster. All these women can't be lying. He need to go to jail. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, all that's fun and dandy, but we're talking about a legal argument and a legal situation. And if his rights were violated, everything after that is like thrown out the window.
Yeah.
So I want to just piggyback and add one other thing. It's possible that, that prosecutor was, just waiting for, Bill Cosby's clock to run out, so to speak, and pass away. You are completely correct. It was an easy overturn, but an alternative view to that might be that maybe he was thinking that the court itself would just get caught up in the sensationalism and uphold the conviction, even though it was supposed to be overturned. So when you look at, as of a few days ago, when I looked at the National Registry of Exonerations, which catalogs exonerations that have happened in this country from 1989 forward, we're up to 2,805 exonerations. When you read the case summary of those cases, there were plenty of red flags along the way, and yet courts did not reverse the conviction. But the average length of wrongful imprisonment is 14 years, and it's typical that by the time somebody is exonerated, their appeals have long since been denied. And I mentioned that to make this point, which is that having the law and facts on your side, is really only half the battle. I mean, the other half is, are the judges actually going to follow the law? Are they really going to critically look at a case, or are they going to just rubber stamp deny it? And too many times they rubber stamp deny it. So it's possible that, the prosecutor was thinking that the courts were going to just rubber stamp deny Bill Cosby's appeal and keep the conviction preserved in that way.
Yeah, it is. Like Jeff said, it is amazing. That they looked at his case. When you think about it, from 2018 to 2021 with the pandemic, they don't usually look at cases this quick. This is very quick case and a turnaround. It's not normal that 3 years goes by. Like usually it is at least 10, 15 years, and most people will cop a plea or cop a plea and get resentenced, or either get out and it's a partial overturnment or whatever. He got a full reversal.
And many
I think
people
the fact
don't.
that he's rich and
Many people.
famous had anything to do with that.
I do. I think that his being famous had something to do with it, and I also think the fact that he had several lawyers. I mean, working for him. Lawyers who were good. Frankly, I mean, many of us can't afford private lawyers, and there is another way that there is a two-tiered justice system. It's not only race; it also has to do with class and socioeconomic status.
Yeah. What's the old saying? Justice is for those who can afford it. Something like that.
Yeah, there's that, and there's justice is just us.
Yeah. Yeah. Just us poor folks.
Or the statement, capital punishment, right? Them without the capital get the punishment.
There you go. That's a good way to put it. Now, did they teach you that in law school, or did you come up with that one on your own?
Uh, neither. I've read that, but that wasn't part of my official education in law school. I wish I could claim credit for originating that, but no, that's a saying that's you can read, and I've read it. Yeah.
Anybody got anything else to add about the Civil War or the Reconstruction?
I'll add a little about the Civil War. Robert E. Lee never referred to the North as the enemy ever. He referred to them as those people, even enemy soldiers. They were always called those people. And he said at the end of the war that military education was the biggest mistake he made in his life. And as far as U.S. Grant goes, Grant was equally, I think, a good patron in all this. He sympathized with this at Appomattox when they did that surrender. Lee was amazed at how conciliatory Grant was towards his soldiers. He let them keep their sidearms, pretty much let them keep in everything, just let them go. And he said even though one of their cause was one of the worst that people have ever fought for, he admired their tenacity in doing it. And that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah. Let me bring up one more question before we wrap it up, and let's talk about Juneteenth. Quentin, you mentioned Juneteenth, and a lot of African Americans in the United States don't really think July the 4th is their Independence Day. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I think it's more of understanding that some Black Americans ancestors were still enslaved during the quote unquote Independence Day, which really should have been July 2nd, is when they signed the agreement. So I think that what happens is a lot of Black Americans may feel like, I wasn't independent or I wasn't free during that time, or my ancestors weren't free during that time, during the Independence Day. So they feel like, I'm not going to celebrate it, or I'm going to celebrate Juneteenth. I think that my personal belief, if you choose to celebrate it, you choose to celebrate it as an American. And that's one of the biggest things, is that we're always evolving as a country and as people. So we're always getting or learning more information, and we shouldn't celebrate this, we shouldn't celebrate that. Even speaking when Bob was speaking about Robert Lee, I'm always amazed that these Confederate statues were still around. I don't really have an opinion, or a bad opinion or a good opinion in regards to the statutes. I just always, I never like most people, I never paid attention to those things. As a kid, and I always bring this up, as a kid, I was a big Dukes of Hazzard fan. So I knew the car was named after General Lee. But my grandfather, being from Georgia, he never said, you shouldn't watch the show. He never said anything. Why the elders never said anything? I don't know. I don't know why they never said anything. I think that we do need to be upset and proud of our history as Americans. I think that it's not, I think it's more of like, it's like the black eye. You have a black eye, but you don't want to put nothing on it. You don't want to ice it down. It's a black eye. You still got to put ice on it. You still got to realize you got some scars, but you should. I think that one of the biggest things in our country that makes it so diverse and why it's so divisive is some of us aren't proud of our history. One of the young ladies that I host a show with, Steve, and and Jeff and Bob don't know yet. One of her famous statements that she makes, and her family, half of her family were never slaves. They were born in Canada. They know their history, their lineage all the way back. But one of her favorite statements that she makes is Black trauma, white guilt. And if you ever talk to her and get her to explain in depth what she means, is you'll see that a lot of Black people are traumatized, and some rightfully so, of what happened. And then you have some people who would consider themselves, and I say this with all due respect to anybody that considers themselves white, some people that will say white and I'm guilty, or I feel guilty about what I did. And in all actuality, we need to really look at race in this country a little bit different, and how other countries look at race. It's more of a tribalism thing. In America, it's more, no, it's Black, white, or Black people of color. I think that's a little, we need to do a little bit of research and understand that even within what we consider the white race or whatever in this country, some nationalities weren't even considered white. I mean, it's a good book that I've read a couple of times called White by Law. And it talks about how some of the Irish Americans weren't considered white at a certain time, and even some of the Italians weren't considered white at a certain time during this country. And I think that the more that we understand what was going on during Reconstruction with the Black codes, Jim Crow, how the North was basically opening up the country to foreign immigrants and getting a lot of the European immigrants to do some of their quote unquote labor that the southern states were doing slavery, which was by law illegal. And the northern states were getting European immigrants. They were influxing the immigrants and basically giving them what we would consider cheap labor. And it's amazing how this has always been a major divide in this country, and it's all about capitalism, labor, and building the wealth. So I think that's interesting. I didn't mean to take your question too far, Steve. And
No, that's okay.
I think that we should all be proud of where we live at, and proud and upset with some of the things that have went on.
Yeah. And I can only wear this shirt one day out of the year, guys. So, you know. July the 4th is the day.
Did anybody watch the hot dog eating at Coney Island?
Oh, he downed 75 hot dogs, right?
Yeah, he broke his own record.
Who did?
It was what's his name? I can't think of his name. The hot dog eating contest. He's an American guy. I forget his name though.
Probably a little
time I
skinny
looked it up
fellow.
real quick. Joey Chestnut, that's his name.
Okay.
Joey Chestnut. He downed 76 hot dogs, I think, in what, like 10 minutes, something like that. Yeah, he broke his own record.
Wow. He'll be sick for a while.
Those guys, though, they call them athletes. You know, they work out all. They prepare, they get their bodies ready to do that sort of thing. And he's slim. He's not a heavy guy.
No, it's usually skinny people that win those competitions.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, I appreciate.
I'm not really sold that that's a sport, though. I mean, I would challenge that designation.
Yeah. I don't see it making.
I know that people consider it a sport. Some people do, but I mean, to me, it's not really. I don't see how that's a sport.
It's the one day that anybody that eats hot dogs, it probably turns their stomach like, oh, how could you eat that many? Like, ugh, it just took me out. I mean, I think everybody that does eat meat, as sort of say, even the ones that don't eat meat, they got this Impossible or turkey stuff. I think everybody likes a good hot dog, but on this day, when you see that news flash pop up on your screen, you're like, makes you want to hate Nathan's hot dogs because they stood bad.
Well, fellas, thank you for being with me this evening. I've enjoyed our conversation.
All right, Steve. Thanks for having me and us.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Thank you. And you're invited back next week. If you're interested, we'll be talking about the civil rights movement. So that should be an interesting conversation.
Sounds good.
All righty. And
All right.
Thanks for tuning in to Conversations About America. Please tune in each and every Sunday evening for your weekly dose of educational entertainment. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Happy 4th, and I'll send you all a link to this probably in about 30 to 45 minutes, okay?
All right,
All
thank you,
right.
Steve. Take
Thank you,
care.
Steve.
Take care, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Goodbye,
fellas.
guys. All right.